Welcome back to Release Your Inner Power podcast. We have a special guest today. I'm excited to introduce Cecilia. Welcome to the podcast, Cecilia.
Thanks for having me, Shauna.
We're excited for our
So
conversation.
excited to be here.
I know this is going to be a really good conversation. When we first met and started chatting a little bit and talking about what you do and how you help people, I was like, this is going to be a real juicy episode. I'm going to be excited to see
I
all
know, I'm excited.
So tell us, our listeners, what makes you you? What's your path to get to where you are? A little bit about who Cecilia is.
Oh, it's such a big question.
Mhm.
I'll give you the short of the long story, I guess.
Yeah.
Who I am. So I Canadian, born to immigrant parents, so first generation Canadian, firstborn of 4 children. So lots of pressure to perform and be a high achiever. So all the perfect grades. But what came out of that is because my parents came from different countries, is they gifted me with a passion for speaking out against injustices and social injustice and all those things. And I was quite a bit of a loudmouth, as my dad might say, when I was a bit younger, pointing out all the things that were wrong with the world, which naturally led me to go to social work. So I ended up going into social work in my 20s and found a home in social work, which is all about helping people, the disadvantaged, but also really understanding the world and how systems really oppress people and keep people limited from access of resources. And I would say I really found my voice in that space quite a bit, actually. And I guess the journey into boundaries is really being able to speak up for other people who basically didn't have a voice. And from social work, it kind of evolved, and I ended up kind of pursuing more of a therapy path and helping people find their voice and heal through trauma. Um, and that's kind of led me into business. And I run my own group private practice. And I run a team of about 12 people, 12 therapists at this point. Um, really work hard in the community and now kind of expanding into the coaching world just a little bit. Just being able to hone into a little bit of helping people cultivate connection and how boundaries fit into that and how it works with relationships. Um, and then that led me to my own podcast. And here I am.
Ooh, I love that. I love that. I love how you said a little bit of a loud mouth when you were little. It's interesting too, because I feel like if you do find your voice when you're little, like that's usually how it's
That's
like.
what you get called.
Yeah, it's just like, okay, you talk too much, or you're being a little bit too
Right.
much or whatever. And it's interesting to see how when you're a kid it's different, but then when you're older, it's like, okay, wait, like we can't say that now.
No. Well, in fact, it's like, it's kind of, it leads into your superpower.
Yeah.
Right? It's like as a kid, it was looked down upon in some ways, right? The feedback to my report cards was always, "Cecilia's a great student. She just talks too much." Or she's trying to make conversation with everybody all the time. And so I would get in trouble for that all the time. And then I became an adult and I get paid to talk a lot and I get paid to, share and help people and have conversation with people. So it just kind of turned this thing that was seen as not a really great skill as a child because I wasn't following the rules, and now I get to break all the rules and it becomes my superpower, which is the greatest gift, I would say, is being able to build a career out of, being a bit of a loudmouth.
Yeah. I love that. I love how you talk about it too, because it's like, so it's, you can choose to be like, oh yeah, I talk too much or whatever, or you can just continue to go and be like, no, there's, like you said, there's something wrong with this. I need to speak
Mhm.
up about this. I need to, say the things. I love that because I think it's super important to have a voice for others that may not have a
Mhm.
voice. You could be that like
Mhm.
beacon or guiding light, if you will, to help out other people. And it's so powerful and motivating and also empowering for the people that may not yet have it. And then you're just
Mhm.
kind of pulling it out of them by like, see, you can, yes, you can. And like do it for them and eventually hopefully pass the baton to themselves if they learn,
Exactly.
if you will, so they can speak up for themselves and have their own voice.
Exactly.
That's so great. That's so great. You said at the very end that you have a podcast. Tell us a little bit more about your podcast before we dive into
Oh.
some other things.
Great. My podcast is Mental Makeover Radio. And the reason I named it a mental makeover because what we have is super amazing. I think we're all magical beings and we all have something that's very unique about us. And often we think or maybe the narrative out there is that you have to like rebuild or become a whole different person. And for me, it was just like, well, physically we do makeovers and we love those makeover stories, but we never really talk about what a mental makeover. It's like it's just tweaking what's there, keeping what's really great and amazing about you, but just shifting some of the things to work to your advantage. So that's kind of where the name came from. And on the podcast, I have audiences can submit a question, so I can just kind of answer their question, kind of like an old school. We used to write into the newspaper asking for advice. Sometimes I just talk about mental health topics or have people come in and talk about different things or answer specific questions. And it's all about having one small actionable thing you can do to create great change in your life.
I love that. I love that.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I remember reading too how you were saying like it's broken down to be like everyday life action, so it's not doesn't seem so
Mhm.
big. It's like a smaller step that so it's not so overwhelming to
'Cause
take.
that's really how change happens. It
Mm.
actually doesn't happen in this massive, you know, 180 shift. We like to think it does, but the truth is like we just don't. Humans really detest that kind of change. We can do it in really extreme circumstances. Let's say if we're in the middle of a war, we all make it changes. But when it comes to every single day, we actually don't like making big changes. Humans are the psychology of how we do change is one incremental step at a time. And when you do one thing, it compounds. It has this like massive ripple effect when you do one thing different. So that's kind of how I coach. And it's the way that I run my podcast is making small changes to compound really great change.
Yes, I love that. I love that. I want to get into talking about boundaries, which I'm really excited
Yes.
about because people that have worked with you say you're the queen of boundaries. So I'm really excited to dive into the boundaries aspect. Can you tell me more about
Mhm.
how you started with this, how you got your name Queen of Boundaries, and then give us some tidbits on it?
Oh my gosh, the nicknames are great.
I know
I
it.
I think it originally came from when I was early on in my career, I worked in, sexual assault center. So I just worked with survivors of sexual abuse. And I did that for about 9 years and did all the trauma work. And what came out of that was helping people set boundaries because one of the things that comes from trauma, especially sexual trauma, is a violation of all the pieces of ourselves. And a lot of survivors would feel like they didn't have autonomy of their physical body anymore. And it was really difficult to say no because in the face of trauma, they maybe did say no or they were violated and they didn't have that voice. And I found a lot of the work that I was doing was around reclaiming their sense of self, reclaiming their autonomy, which came with setting boundaries. And it just kind of catapulted from there. And, everyone would be like, you're so good at it. You're such a queen of boundaries. And then when I went into my own private practice, I was still doing the same kind of work. And I still do it today because as women, we're just not really socialized to have a voice. And we've come a long way. I would say it's very different today than when I was in my, let's say, teens. The teens today have a very different context of culture and society than I did. Because I grew up in the 90s, so it's very different. But there's still this idea of women being silenced and not having a voice. And when they do set boundaries or they do share a need or a want or desire, it gets labeled. If it's too harsh, it's considered to be bitchy. If it's too soft, it's too passive or you're a pushover. And there's all these kind of labels we give women who are trying to set boundaries. And then couch in that, there's this idea that I'm not deserving of, or I'm not worthy of these boundaries, or I have to earn it somehow. Like I have to give so much in order to get anything in return. Whereas typically men don't walk through the world this way. Men actually, most men set boundaries really easy. They don't even think about it. It's not even a thought in their mind that their boundary isn't gonna be respected or their need is gonna be rejected. Like, they're just not socialized in the same way. They're not socialized to have to care for all these relationships first. So I just continue to work with boundaries, and that's what I've built a bit of reputation on. I get a little bit of like a no bullshit approach to boundaries. Like, the world is not gonna stop revolving because you say no. And just really helping and coaching women to find a voice to build their life in the way that they want it. And when they realize that nothing awful happens, there's this confidence that kind of shows up and was like, okay, well, I can do it all over the place now. And then it just compounds and compounds over time, which is really exciting to be part of that. And so that's kind of where, calling me the boundary queen, and my clients call me that. So, which I think is really funny.
I do. I love that. When I read that, I was like, I love this. This is great. I love that. The boundary queen. That's so cool. You're so right about, like how you say society, like through, societal norms, how
Mhm.
we get labeled as speaking out and all of that. And it's like the hurdle that, some people have to get over. And I think it's just amazing. Like you said, once you get over that hurdle by taking those little steps, then you're like, it like opens up a whole new world, like you said, where it's just, I can
Mhm.
do this all over the place. And then you're just like trying all new kinds of things. It's like a way of freeing yourself to be able to do more of
Mhm.
those things. And then, kind of like how I would say, like releasing your inner power of giving yourself permission to do this and do it. And then you feel so much more
Mhm.
powerful, so much more of a voice, and so much more empowering of yourself by doing those things. I
Mhm.
think it's great. I love that. I love the work that you do. I think it's so amazing.
Yeah, and I think that, again, I think also people think it's just about saying no. And
Mhm.
so one of the things I help in with clients that I work with, people I work with, is understanding that it actually doesn't always sound like a no, because the word no, it has a lot of emotional load to it. So we all have our experiences of no that come from childhood, but no can sound very differently. It can be, thanks for the offer, I don't have time in my schedule.
Mhm.
It can be, thanks for the invitation, I've already committed to another event that night. I really appreciate the invite. So it doesn't have to sound so, I don't know, aggressive. I think a lot of people, especially women, think that boundaries sound aggressive, or they're going to turn into somebody that is really aggressive
Mhm.
because they're setting boundaries. The option is people pleasing on one end of the spectrum, or being super aggressive on the other end of the spectrum. Whereas boundaries is in the middle, because the way that I approach boundaries is that we set boundaries from a place of love.
Mhm.
It's not in a place of avoidance or pushing away or creating distance in a relationship. Is that boundaries come from a place of love, and it actually facilitates a deeper connection with another person. And when we go from that place, it feels soft, but it feels clear.
Mhm.
So, and that's the important piece. It doesn't have to feel rigid or aggressive. It can feel really soft and loving, but it's also really clear of where the limits actually are, where I end and you begin, what
Mhm.
I'm willing to provide or able to provide, and what is not on the table of what I can actually do. And in that clarity, we actually have better relationships. We have better connections, because the other person gets to know us.
Mhm.
And then you get to be seen by this other person. And that creates a closeness in any relationship, whether it's a friendship or a colleague or an intimate partner or parenting, whatever the relationship is. Boundaries actually bring people closer together. But somehow in society, we think it's actually the opposite.
Yeah, I'm actually really, really glad that you said that, because that was one of the things I was going to bring up, is that it's very confusing because a lot of people think that boundaries are the negative side. They're just automatically
Right.
assumed to be a negative thing of like saying no or putting somebody off or blocking them out or putting up a wall or like all of that thing. And it's so much more than that. But it's
Mhm.
interesting how we go straight to that first versus understanding that you're actually doing, you might even be putting up boundaries you don't even realize are boundaries because of the way that you're
Mhm.
perceiving that they are. And
Right.
and like you could be doing that all day already, and then start realizing like, oh, I'm actually doing this, and it's in your
Mhm.
delivery. You don't have to deliver, like you said, aggressively, or it has to be this like drawing a line, in the cement or sand, if you will, of like this, like it can be from a place of love, just like you said, and
Mhm.
coming from a crystal clear spot. So then they know how to interact with you. So you could be doing it right now and not realizing it, just because the tendency is to always go, oh, boundaries
Right.
are like you know, boundaries are the negative ones of like pushing people out or saying no more. That's a section of it, but that's not
Right.
boundaries. So I'm so glad that you
No,
said.
and the truth, right, and the truth is we already all, so even someone who comes to me and says, "I have no boundaries. I'm a complete people pleaser." And I usually call bullshit on that, because here's the reason. We all have boundaries because we're socialized into them. Things like, if you're in a lineup, we intuitively know what is the appropriate distance to the stranger in front of us, because if someone behind us is standing too close, internal dialogue is automatic, like, why the hell is this person standing so goddamn close to me?
Yeah.
Don't they know the rules? Like, come on now.
Yeah.
Right? So there's all these already boundaries we have, and I really encourage people to take an audit. Like, if you're struggling with boundaries, take an audit of what you already do with boundaries, because they're there. Driving is all about boundaries, right? It's like they're the rules of the road, but they're all about boundaries. They're like, what can I do and what can I not do? Where's my space end and the other person's space begin? Right? So we already have these boundaries that we think that we don't have. So it's a really good place to start, is like taking an audit. What am I already doing? And then taking an audit around, okay, so where do I need them? Because they may not all be created equally, right? We also like to paint it with one big brush, right? And instead of thinking, well, which relationships require them and which ones are more imminent that I need to maybe set, because I think it's important to look at those things and to start at the easiest. It's always starting. Most people come in, when they come in to want to work on boundaries, they want to pick like their biggest boundary buster in their life. They're like, I got trouble with my mom. And by the way, everyone's got some boundaries with their mom.
Yes.
That they need to probably set with their moms.
Yes.
But they pick the biggest person. And what makes the most sense is actually pick the easiest person, because you get to practice there. And you get to, ask a friend to say, hey, I'm really trying to work on my boundaries. Can I practice with you? Can we practice together? Can we engage in this learning together? Which seems really silly and you might laugh and all the things. But what it does, it helps you build up that courage to then slowly build into the relationships that maybe are a little bit harder, or situations that are a little bit harder. Because I think with having some confidence, it's really helpful then to kind of encounter that person who is probably the most problematic in your life. So I would start with a place of take an audit and then pick the least threatening or the most safe situation to start to practice some of those boundaries, to build some confidence, just to see how it brings that relationship closer.
Yeah. As well as the awareness of the level of boundaries you're already using and how you can, you
Mhm.
said, it's like flexing a muscle, like working out a muscle. You just have to
Mhm.
keep doing it for practice, and it gets stronger and stronger and stronger the more you
Mhm.
practice it. I like how you said to ask, a friend to practice, that's close to you and that's easier, because I think that I don't know, there's just something there that would also help them. Like, it's a win-win for all around.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? And then
100%.
and then it makes you stronger with your boundaries, like you said, with the difficult person. And I really like that you start with, somebody where it's easier before just diving into the big monster one that, like, and I'm sure it is. It's like
Mhm.
you said, because everybody wants to fix it. Like right now, everybody wants the quickest way, if you will. So they start with the big boundary. This is what I have to do now, because it's like probably bothering them the most. But I like how you say to back it up a little bit, start building up to that, because it will be easier
Mhm.
in the end. That's really great. What else? If somebody finds that, like, does their audit and then they find, what they need to work on, and start lower and then kind of work your way and practice up to it. Where do you find people get stuck? Like, where do you find where people get stuck, and they
Mhm.
they just need that little bit of encouragement, or a little bit, like, what is a tool that they can use to get over that hurdle of getting stuck where it feels like they're just not making progress with it?
I love it. It's a great question. Most people get stuck with, they think the boundary is just about saying the no or setting the limit, and they miss that the most important part is actually sharing what your need is, right? And so, unfortunately, we're like in this cancel culture kind of time where people are just like, I don't like you. Boom, I'm blocking, deleting you, whatever it is, and that's my boundary. It's not really it kind of is, but it isn't a boundary. What it is you're just being really avoidant. And that's super great if it's a dangerous situation or you're really unsafe or it's abusive. By far, I agree. Cut things off, done. But a boundary isn't just simply saying no. And most people think it's just like, I'm just going to say no. Boundaries follow up with a need. And so that is the part that brings us closer together. So an example of that would be, I have a friend who doesn't like swearing. I swear and cuss like a trucker. You know, I'll drop F-bombs all over the place all the time. But I have a friend who just doesn't like it. It's the way she grew up. She finds it offensive and she doesn't like it. And in our friendship, you know, she said to me, you know, I can appreciate this is a way that you speak in the world. However, I find it offensive. You know, can you, you know, reduce the amount of your swearing? Now, I have two options. My option could be like a really clear, screw you, friendship's over because you're telling me how to be and I get really reactive. Or I can sit in a place of, do I value this friendship? Do I value this relationship? And can I adjust how I show up in a way that meets her need for safety and my need for this friendship? And it's like, of course, because I don't swear around children. So clearly I can moderate my swearing. And so it brings our relationship closer because then I continue to respect her. She feels seen and heard, and then we're closer friends. And so it's not just about don't do this or please no. It's also, this is my need that's attached to it. And that's where most people get a little bit stuck, where they were like, well, I said no to this person, but they kept on asking and they kept on pursuing, or they asked me again. It's like, but if you're not sharing what your need is, then how would they know? We
Mhm.
have to tell people how to treat us. Like we assume everybody else is going to read our minds and know exactly what we need and want. But I don't even know what I need from moment to moment. So how could I ever hope that someone else is going to make the right guess for me? I have to be really clear about what my needs are. So that's a place that most people get really stuck, is they just give a no without a follow-up of, this is my need in this moment. So I think it's just journaling that piece out, is when you're making an audit of the places that you need boundaries, is to kind of attach a, like, what is my need with this? Do I need safety? Do I need space? Do I need time? Do um I need, you know, I don't know, less stressful situation? Do I need to take into consideration my time commitment? Like, what is it that you actually need? Because that's where the boundary comes from, a place of love instead of it feeling really harsh and aggressive.
Yeah, I love that. And I like how you said journal it out with it. So then you're kind of more clear, not kind of, you are more
Mhm.
clear on
Mhm.
the whole situation, like why you're setting the boundary, what your need is. But then you can also think about how to deliver it, right? Like, how do I say this
Mhm.
in like a constructive, like loving way instead of like, jab to the throat way.
Well, it's loving to ourselves, right? It's not just loving to the person, but what it does is, I'm setting this because I'm the only one in charge of taking care of myself. And
Mhm.
I'm the one that has to take care of every piece and every aspect of who I am. That's on me. That's my responsibility. So out of love for me, I'm setting this boundary, and it translates in my love for you. I'm making this really clear, because if I assume good intent, I assume you don't want to be an asshole towards me. I
Right.
assume you don't want to hurt me on purpose. So here's my need attached to it. Now, however the person responds gives you a lot of information.
Mhm.
So if they don't react well, then it's a moment to take some inventory of that relationship. Or
Mhm.
maybe some things need to change, or maybe they're not as close to this person or not. But most people are surprised by, like, how well most people take it.
Yeah, probably because we already come up with how it's going to end up happening when we don't even know how it's going to go down. But we
Right,
fill in the blank of the story of what how it's going to end. Well, it's going to be like this. Well, like you said, you don't know.
right.
Like you don't like you can't assume, which I think a lot of us are guilty of, is
Yes.
this person knows me, so they know what I want. No, they don't. Like you said, I don't
They don't
even know
have a
about
clue.
moment to moment.
They don't have a clue. They have no clue of what you want, because, again, you barely even know what you want. And we create all these stories. And the truth is that our brain is wired to create fear stories out of self-protection. So it's always going to come up with the worst case scenario. Oh, I'm going to set this boundary, I'm going to get fired. Or I'm going to say this and that my partner's going to break up with me. Or my friend's going to ditch me, or they're not going to want me around anymore. We go to like the super extreme.
Yeah.
But in reality, most of the time, that's not what happens.
No. And you surprise yourself. Once you do it, you're like, oh, that's
Oh,
that's
mhm,
not that bad. That was actually okay, But
mhm.
getting past that, like, that little fear story of filling in the blank of really you're grabbing out of air and just putting it in there. Like it's not,
100%.
you're just like, oh yeah, well, this is the end of the story. And then you do it and you're like, oh, I was wrong. It's way wrong. I was off.
Totally wrong.
Yeah.
And a way to challenge that fear is to ask yourself, like, I know everyone listening to this has done hard things. And I know you've done harder things than setting a boundary.
Yeah.
We have all done incredibly difficult things that we probably didn't know we would do or get through or survive. So in the grand scheme of your life, setting a boundary doesn't even come close to comparing to the hardest thing you've ever done in your life. So if you
Mhm.
can do that hard thing, you can do the boundary. It's
Yeah,
actually nothing compared to the hardest thing you've ever done.
for sure. I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, for sure. To remind yourself people don't know what you're
Mhm.
thinking. You don't know the end of the story, and you've done harder things.
Mhm.
It's almost like, especially with boundaries, coming from a place of love and bringing people closer together, that's what you want, right? Like that's the ultimate goal, is to have
Mhm.
more connection and make that a deeper relationship. And like you said, how the response is gives you a lot of information, but that doesn't always mean it's going to be the story you're making up in your head.
Right.
Isn't it funny how we crazy make all the things and just
All the
plan
time.
out our lives that might not even happen? We're just making stuff up.
All the time.
So crazy. So
It
crazy.
is so crazy, and we make a million assumptions, and what I tell clients all the time is like, if you are you willing to confirm that assumption or not? Like, would you ask that person, "Oh, I'm making this assumption." They're like, "No." Well, if you're not willing to ask that person, then you don't have permission then to make that assumption,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Because it's like, or else we can just our brain just goes into this place of like creating all of these crazy stories and assumptions that are not even based in reality.
Mhm.
And we often think like, "Oh, I think it, so therefore it must be true." And it's like, well, no, the brain is just like this amazing magical thing that is constantly on hyperdrive. Like, do not believe what it's saying to you because it's just trying to protect you. So it's going to create these like out of control crazy stories
Mhm.
to somehow protect you from rejection. But rejection is really not a big of a deal. That at the end of the day, no one's died of rejection. No one's cause of death rejection. So, it's worth taking the risk.
Right. Right. Questioning it, taking a risk. Yeah,
Mhm.
you totally like you said, like give yourself permission to do it. Give yourself
Mhm.
permission to go against that fear, if you will, because like you said, it tries to keep you in what it knows.
Mhm. Because what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah. Like you said, there is no death by rejection. I love that. There's no death by rejection, people. Let's start somewhere. You're not going to die. It's going to be fine. It's
It's gonna be fine.
going to be fine. I love that. I love that. Well, I'm trying to think of what else I could ask you. What would be, so I guess with the listeners, and they like if they're listening and they hear what they, if they're hearing and they're like, yes, I need more of this, like
Mhm.
how can you give us an example of how you work with somebody? Like if they reach out to you, how do you kind of work with somebody on the path of boundaries?
Great question. We start with, which sounds really odd, but we start with really focusing on your own value set, because values are a great way to filter boundaries. Um, because that means that the boundaries come from a place that is in your heart and is really connected to who you are and how you want to show up in the world. And when we sit in a place of really understanding what our values are and then getting to know how we want to set boundaries through that value, it feels more heart centered and it's a lot easier to do. It doesn't feel so shooting from the hip kind of idea or just making up shit as you go. It's like, oh, there's a reason for this. So if my one of my core values is integrity, then it's really easy for me to set boundaries through that space of integrity. Right. And so when we're doing boundaries with our values, there's an alignment that happens within us. And that feels really, really good. And we want to get to that good feeling. We want to get to that place of, oh, doing this actually makes me feel more authentic. It makes me feel more grounded in who I am. And that feels powerful in a way that is calming. And so what it does is it decreases that anxiety. So we start out with the values. We do a massive audit around all the relationships, all the areas of your life, where things are working well and what's not working well, where there are boundaries, where there isn't boundaries, and create a bit of a strategy around where to start and picking out those safer places and then what we're working up to. Like, what is the hardest relationship that seems to be the most complex? So we can build up to that relationship. We do a lot of practicing. We do a lot of actually creating scripts. So then you're not having to make it up on the spot. So it becomes really easy, and everyone has their kind of their own custom script because we all talk differently, and we want it to sound very authentic and sound like something you would actually say instead of parroting somebody else's words that maybe don't really make a lot of sense. Um, and then we kind of work up to the hardest relationship and structure what that's going to look like and take a bit of a inventory of that relationship and what is the gain and what is the outcome we're looking for, and maybe if this relationship isn't safe, then what does distance potentially look like? Because I think we need to sometimes negotiate distance and space. So for your own personal growth, doesn't mean forever because boundaries are fluid. They change all the time. But it is kind of creating some confidence and coming heart centered as much as possible, creating something that's just uniquely yours. And then having your own kind of strategy. So then when they don't work with me anymore, they have something they're using and they go off into the sunset. Because I think that's important that people go off and live their lives and then come back whenever they need a bit of a refresher or some additional coaching around some things.
That's great. I love that. Sounds awesome. It's like, okay, so where do I find you? So I can sign up for that.
Well, I have a boundaries workbook for your audience so they can opt into that and get, a bit of the structure of some of my tips around creating some boundaries. And they can get that at ceciliamannella.com/boundaries. So you can get onto my list. You can find me on my podcast, Mental Makeover Radio. You can also find me on Instagram, Mental Makeover Radio, or Cecilia Mannella on Instagram. You can find me on my website and connect with me there as well.
I love that. I will share all of these in the show notes as
Good.
well. So it's easy for you to click on and find Cecilia if you want to chat with her. Please email either one of us and let us know how this episode has touched you or helped you, or share your story with us. We love to hear feedback and how we've helped people.
I would love that.
Yeah, and how we can help further, like how we can touch you guys and really give you like empowering and motivation to do the things that you need to do to grow and to really be yourself. I always like to ask my guests one final question for being on the show. Would you let us know what your superpower is?
Oh, I would say my superpower is being able to take very complex ideas around psychology and change and how we live life, all the books that make, complicated ideas and making them into really small bite-sized pieces. I know that's my superpower, being able to make it very tangible, very actionable, so people can start to take the steps. I think the hardest part is, we can read all these amazing books and authors and self-help, but it's really hard to implement.
Mhm.
It feels like that's a really big piece that's missing is the implementation of things and the how to. And I love being able to take these big ideas and making them into small bite-sized pieces so we can all just change our lives one small step at a time.
That's awesome. That's so true. Taking all of these complicated things, because sometimes when you read all of this stuff, you're like, I don't even know what they're saying. Like sometimes it's just so much that you're just like, okay, that seems big.
Right.
So I love that you have that power to break it down, but then you're sharing it and helping others by breaking it down. So that's awesome. You're like the translator. The translator.
I love it, the translator. I just think we all read these books and we all have a resounding yes. We're like, yes, you're right. Yes, this is who I am. Yes, I need to do this. And then it's like, now I don't know how to do it though. So you've captured me, but now you haven't really told me how to apply it to my life specifically. And they can't do it. Authors can't do it because they're just writing to many. So I am the translator. I do help people translate into actionable steps. So I love that.
I love
I'm
that.
going to use that, Shauna.
Yeah, do it. I love it. I love it. You've got all kinds of little nicknames that are so fun. I love
I
it.
love it.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It was great to have you here, and I loved everything you shared today. It's going to be, I
Oh,
hope a lot of people, and I love that you shared it.
thanks. Thanks for having me, Shauna.
Yeah.